Tea was one of those mornings when the airport was already crowded even before sunrise. People moved in every direction, some rushing to catch early flights, others waiting in long lines with sleepy eyes and coffee cups in their hands. Amid all the noise and movement, one man stood quietly, holding a small travel bag and a folded boarding pass. His name was Lito, a Filipino traveler on his way to an important trip abroad. Lito wasn't dressed like a businessman. He wore a simple polo shirt, jeans, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. His backpack looked old, and the zipper had a tiny keychain shaped like a jeepney, a little reminder of home. He wasn't loud or demanding. In fact, he looked like the kind of person who would rather stay unnoticed. But that day at the airport security checkpoint, things didn't go as peacefully as he had hoped. When his turn finally came to pass through the security lane, the officer behind the counter gave him a long, judgmental look. The man's badge read Officer Miller. He was tall, in his 40s, with a strict face that rarely showed a smile. From the moment Lito approached, Miller's tone carried a mix of boredom and arrogance. "Passport?" Miller said flatly, without even looking up properly. "Yes, sir," Lito replied politely, handing over his travel documents. The officer flipped through the pages, his eyes squinting slightly. "Where are you flying to?" he asked, his tone sharp, almost suspicious. "Singapore, sir. Connecting flight to London," Lito answered. Miller raised an eyebrow. "London?" He looked Lito up and down as if the destination didn't fit the person in front of him. "Business or pleasure?" "Business, sir," Lito said softly. "I'm attending a—" But before he could finish, Miller interrupted with a short laugh. "Business, huh? And what business might that be?" Lito hesitated for a moment. "It's related to trade and government work," he said carefully, not wanting to sound defensive. The officer leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. "Government work?" he repeated, as if the idea was hard to believe. "You don't really look like someone who works for the government." People standing in line began to notice the tone of his voice. A few turned their heads slightly, pretending not to stare but clearly paying attention. Lito felt his heart beat a little faster, though he tried to remain calm. He gave a polite smile. "I understand, sir. It's an official trip." Miller chuckled again, shaking his head. "Sure it is. And I'm the President of the United States," he muttered, loud enough for Lito to hear. A faint, awkward silence followed. The travelers behind Lito shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something wasn't right. But Miller didn't stop there. "Open your bag," he ordered. Lito placed his backpack on the counter and opened it slowly. Inside were a few clothes neatly folded, a book, some documents, and a box of dried mangoes. Gifts he always brought when traveling abroad. Miller began checking the bag roughly, pulling things out carelessly. "What's this?" the officer asked, holding up the box of mangoes as if it were something suspicious. "Dried mangoes, sir. A gift," Lito replied patiently. Miller sniffed and smirked. "You people always bring strange stuff," he muttered under his breath, but not quietly enough. The words stung. Lito looked down for a moment, pretending not to hear. He didn't want to cause trouble. He just wanted to get through security and find his gate. The officer continued to search, tossing items around. Then he gave a sarcastic smile. "You're sure you're traveling for business? Maybe you're just sightseeing? Visiting relatives? Looking for work?" His words came out sharp, layered with hidden insult. Lito took a slow breath. "Sir, I already said I'm on official travel." "I'm attending a conference." "Conference?" Miller repeated, rolling his eyes. "And what kind of conference invites? Travelers like you?" The way he said "travelers like you" carried a tone that everyone could understand. It wasn't curiosity, it was judgment. Some people in line exchanged glances. One woman whispered softly to her companion. Lito could feel his face getting warm, but he kept his voice calm. "Sir, it's a trade and economic forum." Miller's laugh echoed faintly. "Trade and economic forum? Big words. Do you even have an invitation or proof?" "Yes, sir, I do," Lito replied, pulling out a printed letter from his folder. But before he could hand it over, the officer waved his hand dismissively. "Never mind," Miller said, smirking. "I've seen plenty of people try to act important before." Lito blinked, unsure how to respond. The officer clearly enjoyed the small crowd's silent attention. He was used to being the one in control, the one who could decide who passed and who got delayed. For him, Lito was just another traveler, someone he could question, maybe even mock without consequence. At that moment, a child in the nearby lane accidentally dropped a toy. and Lito bent down instinctively to pick it up and hand it back. The small gesture showed the kind of man he was, polite, humble, and patient. But Miller took the moment to comment again. "You're too kind, huh? Maybe you should work here at the airport instead of pretending to be a businessman." The crowd's mood shifted. People were beginning to feel uncomfortable, even if no one dared to speak up. Lito slowly straightened, meeting the officer's gaze with quiet dignity. "Sir," he said softly, "I'm not pretending." Miller stared at him for a second, then shrugged. "We'll see about that," he said, motioning to the next line. "Step aside for additional screening." Lito did as told. He stood silently while another officer ran the metal detector over him. The machine beeped once at his belt buckle, and Miller smiled mockingly. "Guess even your belt doesn't trust you." Lito looked at him, his patience wearing thin, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he thought about his family back home, his wife who always reminded him to stay calm, his parents who had taught him respect, and his colleagues waiting for him overseas. He knew reacting with anger wouldn't help. When the search was over, Miller tossed his passport and boarding pass onto the counter. "Next time, make sure you're ready with proper documents." "You're lucky I'm letting you through," he said. Lito quietly picked up his things, neatly placing them back in his bag. Before leaving, he turned slightly toward the officer and said in a calm, steady voice, "Sir, thank you for doing your job. I hope you have a good day." The words were polite, but they carried weight. Miller frowned, caught off guard by Lito's composure. Most people would have argued or shouted back. But this man didn't. He stayed respectful despite being treated unfairly. As Lito walked toward the boarding area, a few travelers who had witnessed the scene gave him small, sympathetic smiles. One even whispered, "That wasn't right." Lito just nodded, pretending not to hear. Deep inside, though, he felt a mix of sadness and pride. Sadness because people like that officer still existed, quick to judge others based on how they looked. And pride, because he hadn't let anger win. Little did Officer Miller know, the man he had just insulted was not just another traveler with an old backpack. He was a senior representative of a major trade organization, traveling under government orders to attend a global summit. The small, humble-looking bag carried more than just clothes. It held confidential documents and proposals that would later shape new international agreements. But that truth would only come to light later. For now, Lito found a quiet seat near his gate, sipped water from a small bottle, and looked out at the plains through the wide glass window. He didn't feel hatred or revenge, just a quiet hope that someday, people would learn to see others with respect, no matter what they wore or where they came from. As he adjusted his bag beside him, his fingers brushed over his passport. He smiled faintly to himself. "Patience," he murmured. Always patience. He didn't know it yet, but within the next hour, Officer Miller's attitude would change completely. Something would happen that would make him regret every word he had said, but that part of the story was still to come. Lito sat quietly near the large glass window, watching planes take off one after another. The early morning rush had now turned into a steady hum of movement and chatter. People hurried past him, rolling suitcases behind them while announcements echoed from the speakers above. "Flight 287 to Singapore boarding will begin shortly." That was his flight. He glanced down at his boarding pass again. Everything seemed in order, but a small part of him still felt uneasy about what had happened at the security checkpoint. It wasn't the first time someone had judged him by how he looked, but it still stung every time. He had learned long ago to keep calm in such moments, yet it never became easy. Still, he told himself not to dwell on it. He had more important things to focus on: his mission abroad, the people counting on him, and the responsibility that came with his position. He adjusted his watch, checked the time, and began walking toward his boarding gate. As he reached the waiting area, he noticed a few passengers from earlier, the same ones who had seen the incident. Some of them smiled politely, almost as if they wanted to show silent support. Lito smiled back. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. It reminded him that kindness could still exist even in uncomfortable situations. Just as he was settling into his seat near the gate, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Excuse me, sir," the voice said. Lito turned and his smile faded a little. It was Officer Miller. The man stood stiffly, looking slightly uncomfortable. Behind him was another officer, a woman who appeared to be his superior. She carried a tablet in her hand and wore an expression that was both serious and polite. Lito stood up slowly. Yes, sir, he said, his tone calm but cautious. Miller cleared his throat. I, need to check your documents again, he said, avoiding eye contact. Lito frowned slightly. Again, sir? I already went through screening. The female officer stepped in quickly, offering a professional smile. Sir, my apologies for the inconvenience. It's just a routine verification. Won't take a minute. Something in her voice was different, genuine, respectful. Lito nodded and handed over his passport and boarding pass without hesitation. She scanned the documents using her tablet, and after a few seconds her eyes widened slightly. Sir, she said softly, are you Ambassador Lito de la Cruz, representing the Philippine Trade Commission? The people nearby turned their heads. Miller blinked, his face going pale. He suddenly realized who he had insulted earlier. The title ambassador echoed faintly in the air, and the silence that followed felt heavy. Lito gave a small nod. Yes, that's correct, he said simply. The female officer quickly straightened her posture. Sir, I deeply apologize for any inconvenience caused earlier. It seems there was a misunderstanding at the checkpoint. Lito looked at her calmly. His expression didn't show anger or pride, just quiet dignity. It's all right, he said. I understand you're just doing your job, but Miller couldn't hide his embarrassment. He looked down, avoiding Lito's gaze completely. His face turned red and his lips pressed into a tight line. It was clear he wanted to say something, but words failed him. The confidence he had earlier at the checkpoint had completely disappeared. Lito didn't say anything more. He simply took his documents back and nodded politely. Thank you, he said. The female officer bowed her head slightly. Have a safe flight, sir. As they walked away, Miller's superior gave him a stern look. He followed her silently, shoulders heavy, the reality of what had just happened sinking in deeper with every step. Lito sat back down and took a deep breath. He didn't feel happy about what had just unfolded. If anything, he felt a little sad. It wasn't about revenge or proving someone wrong. It was about how easily people could misjudge others based on appearance alone. He looked out the window again, watching as the sun began to rise higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. The world outside seemed calm, almost peaceful. He wished people could see others the same way, not by what they wore or carried, but by who they were inside. After a few minutes, the boarding announcement echoed again. Passengers for Flight 287 to Singapore, please proceed to Gate 14. Lito picked up his bag and joined the line. As he walked forward, he noticed Miller and his supervisor standing a short distance away, watching him quietly. Miller gave a small, nervous nod, an unspoken apology. Lito returned the nod with a gentle smile before walking toward the gate. It wasn't forgiveness spoken in words, but in silence, and sometimes that was enough. As Lito stepped into the jet bridge, one of the airline staff recognized his name on the boarding pass. Good morning, Ambassador, she said warmly. We're honored to have you with us, he smiled softly. Thank you. Just call me Lito, he said, his humble tone surprising her. Inside the plane, Lito took his seat in business class, but his mind was still at the airport. He thought about how many travelers like him, ordinary-looking, quiet, polite, might have gone through similar experiences, treated unfairly just because of assumptions. He hoped that in some small way what happened that morning might change something. Meanwhile, back at the security office, Miller stood nervously in front of his supervisor. She was clearly disappointed. Miller, she said firmly, you know how serious this is. That man you insulted wasn't just a regular traveler. He's a government representative. You could have caused a major diplomatic issue. Miller swallowed hard. I didn't know, ma'am. He looked like... She cut him off immediately. He looked like what? Like he didn't belong here? That's not how this job works. Her tone was sharp but controlled. Everyone deserves respect. No exceptions. Miller looked down again. He had no excuse. The truth was he hadn't treated Lito badly because of any real reason, just assumptions. The man was soft-spoken, modest and humble, and somehow that made him think he could talk down to him. But now, standing in front of his superior, Miller realized how wrong he'd been. His supervisor sighed. I'll be reporting this incident. You'll receive a formal warning, maybe even retraining. Consider yourself lucky he didn't file a complaint. Yes, ma'am. Miller said quietly. As she left the room, Miller sat down heavily on a nearby chair. His mind replayed every moment from that morning. The words he'd said, the way he'd laughed, the dismissive tone. The memory made him cringe. He wished he could take it back. For the first time in years, he saw his job differently. He had spent so long thinking that authority meant power. But now he realized that real professionalism was about respect, not control. While he sat in silence, the female officer returned. "You know," she said gently, "he could have made a big deal about it. But he didn't. You should think about why." Miller nodded slowly. "I know. I was wrong." "Then make it right," she said before leaving. Back on the plane, Leto opened a small notebook he always carried. On the first page, he had written a simple quote years ago. "Character is how you treat people who can't do anything for you." He smiled faintly as he read it again. He thought about Officer Miller. He didn't feel hatred. Instead, he felt a strange kind of sympathy. Maybe the man had never been taught how to look beyond appearances. Maybe he had just forgotten what respect meant. The flight attendants began serving breakfast. Leto thanked them kindly, speaking with warmth and gratitude. One of them smiled and said, "You're very kind, sir." He chuckled softly. "Kindness doesn't cost anything," he replied. As the plane rose above the clouds, the world below became smaller and smaller. The airport, the noise, the embarrassment, all of it seemed far away now. Yet in Leto's heart, he knew this experience would stay with him. He didn't know that later that day. Videos from the airport's CCTV would circulate among staff, showing exactly how he had been treated and how he had handled it with quiet grace. Many would watch it and feel ashamed, realizing how easily people make unfair judgments. And Officer Miller, he would remember that morning for a long time. Every time he checked another traveler, he'd see Leto's calm face in his mind and remind himself to speak kindly, to judge less, and to treat everyone, no matter how they looked, with dignity. For now, though, as the plane cruised high above the clouds, Leto leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. The sun shone through the window, warm and golden. He whispered to himself, "Sometimes silence teaches louder than words." He didn't need revenge. The truth had already spoken for him, and soon, everyone would know exactly who he was, and how one act of quiet respect could change the way people see others forever. The plane landed smoothly in Singapore after almost 4 hours of flight. As the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers stood up, stretching and gathering their bags. Leto waited patiently in his seat, letting others go first. He was never in a hurry to rush out. He believed that patience showed more class than pushing forward. When it was finally his turn, he took his small bag from the overhead bin and smiled politely at the flight attendants as he exited the plane. "Thank you," he said kindly. "Have a safe journey, sir," one of them replied, still unaware of who he truly was. Inside the airport, Leto followed the signs leading to the transfer area for connecting flights. The Singapore airport was bright and full of life. Shops glowed with colorful lights, people hurried in every direction, and announcements echoed in several languages. He had about 3 hours before his next flight to London, so he found a quiet corner near a cafe, ordered a cup of hot tea, and opened his laptop to review some important documents for the upcoming conference. While reading, he received a message from his assistant back in Manila. "Sir, the delegation in London is already preparing for your arrival. Everything is set for your speech tomorrow." Leto replied with a short, thankful message. "Good, I'll arrive as planned. See you all soon." He sipped his tea, feeling calm again. The earlier airport incident was behind him, or so he thought. But meanwhile, far away, the story was beginning to spread. Back at the airport where the confrontation had happened, a few travelers who had witnessed the scene started talking about it. One of them, a young man who had been standing behind Leto in the line, had quietly recorded a short clip on his phone, not out of malice, but because he couldn't believe how rudely the officer had spoken to such a polite traveler. Later, while waiting for his own flight, the young man uploaded the short video online with a caption, "Never judge someone by how they look." This man stayed calm even when insulted at the airport. Moments later, the officer found out who he really was. Within hours, the post began to gain attention. Thousands of people started watching, commenting and sharing it. Some wrote about how they had faced similar situations, while others praised the Filipino traveler for his patience and humility. By the time Lito's connecting flight was halfway to London, the video had gone viral. Meanwhile, Officer Miller was having one of the longest days of his life. After being called into the security office for the second time that afternoon, he sat in front of the same female supervisor who had spoken to him earlier. But this time the tone was even more serious. "Miller," she began, her voice calm but firm. "The incident with the ambassador has now reached the airport director's office. They've reviewed the footage." Miller felt his stomach drop. "Ma'am, I didn't mean to disrespect him," he said quickly. "You did disrespect him," she interrupted, but not harshly. "Maybe not intentionally, but you did. You let your assumptions guide how you treated a traveler. You forgot that everyone who passes through this airport deserves the same level of respect." He had no answer. He knew she was right. The supervisor sighed. "He didn't file a complaint. But that doesn't change the fact that your behavior reflected poorly on this department." Miller nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. I understand." As the meeting continued, the supervisor said something that stayed in his mind long after. "Do you know why this man didn't report you?" she asked. Miller shook his head. "Because he had more grace than most people do," she said softly. "He taught you a lesson without raising his voice. And maybe that's what you needed." After she dismissed him, Miller left the room feeling heavier than before. The uniform he had once worn proudly now felt uncomfortable. Every person who passed by in the hallway seemed to look at him differently, though he wasn't sure if it was just in his mind. He sat alone in the staff lounge, staring at his badge on the table. His thoughts wandered back to that moment when he had mocked the man for carrying dried mangoes. It had seemed funny to him then, but now it felt cruel and unnecessary. He realized how small that action made him look, how it exposed his lack of empathy. Later that evening, when his shift ended, Miller drove home in silence. The road lights blurred past him, but his mind was somewhere else. He thought about his own father, who used to tell him, "Respect is the only thing that doesn't cost money, but it can make you rich in character." He hadn't understood it back then. But now it made painful sense. At home, he sat on his couch, opened his phone, and was shocked to see the viral video on his social media feed. The caption was clear: "Humility wins over arrogance." The video had already reached millions of views. Though the post didn't show his name or face clearly, anyone who worked at the airport could tell who he was. Reading the comments made his chest tighten. One said, "That officer should learn what professionalism means." Another wrote, "The traveler handled it like a true gentleman." Someone else commented, "Power doesn't come from a uniform. It comes from character." Miller couldn't read anymore. He locked his phone and leaned back, closing his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt truly ashamed. Not because the world was watching, but because he finally saw himself the way others did. He thought about apologizing. But how? The ambassador was already gone, thousands of miles away. Maybe he would never get the chance. The next morning, at the same airport, things felt different. Everyone in the department had heard about the story. People whispered about it during breaks. Some avoided talking to Miller altogether, while others quietly offered him advice. One older officer, someone who had worked there for decades, sat beside him in the cafeteria. "You know, son," the man said gently, "we all make mistakes. The important thing is what you do after." Miller nodded. "I don't even know how to fix this." The older man smiled faintly. "Start with how you treat the next person. Respect everyone. Don't let uniforms make you forget that people are people." That line stayed with him. Meanwhile, Lito's plane touched down in London. The weather was cold and misty, a big change from the warmth back home. As he stepped out of the airport, officials from the host country welcomed him with formal greetings. Cameras flashed as he was escorted to a car that would take him to his hotel. But even as he smiled and waved politely, part of his mind remained on the airport encounter. It wasn't anger he felt, it was reflection. He thought about how quickly people make assumptions, how easily kindness gets overlooked. He hoped the officer had learned something from the experience. The next morning, during the International Trade Conference, Lito delivered his speech to an audience of global delegates. His voice was calm, confident, and filled with wisdom. But near the end, he added something personal, something inspired by what had happened to him just a day earlier. He said, "Before we talk about trade, policies, and progress, we must first talk about respect. True progress begins when we treat people equally, whether they are a leader, a worker, or a traveler passing through an airport. The value of a person cannot be measured by how they look, but by how they act. The audience applauded warmly. Some even stood, touched by his sincerity. That short, heartfelt message would later be quoted in newspapers and online articles. People admired his humility and the way he turned an unpleasant experience into a lesson for the world. Back home, when Officer Miller read about the ambassador's speech, he felt both humbled and inspired. He realized that the man he had once underestimated was not only intelligent and kind, but also capable of changing hearts through his words. From that day on, Miller changed how he worked. He greeted every traveler with respect, no matter how they looked or where they came from. Some people noticed the change and appreciated it. Others simply passed by without realizing how deep the transformation was, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he knew he had learned something real. Days later, a letter arrived at the airport office. It was from the Philippine embassy. Inside was a short message written in neat handwriting. To the security officer at Gate 7, mistakes happen, but learning from them makes us better. I hope you never lose your sense of duty. Only strengthen it with kindness. Sincerely, Lito de la Cruz. Miller read it several times. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from emotion. The letter wasn't angry. It wasn't proud. It was forgiving. He placed it carefully in his locker, where it stayed for years. A quiet reminder that respect and humility are worth more than authority or pride. And from that day forward, he promised himself something simple yet powerful. Never again would he judge someone by how they looked. Because behind every face, every accent, every small act of patience, there might be a story, a lesson, or a person greater than he could ever imagine. The morning sunlight poured through the large glass walls of the airport. Travelers came and went, dragging suitcases, waving goodbye to loved ones, or rushing to catch their flights. Life at the airport never stopped, and for most people, it was just another ordinary day. But for Officer Miller, every new traveler who walked up to his checkpoint reminded him of one thing. That day. It had been a few weeks since the incident with the Filipino traveler, yet the memory was still fresh in his mind. The video had slowly stopped trending online, but inside the airport people hadn't forgotten. Some had even changed the way they spoke to passengers, trying to be more polite and respectful. In a strange way, the quiet traveler had unknowingly changed the culture of the workplace. Miller stood at his usual spot, checking passports and bags as people passed through. But something was different now. His tone had softened. His eyes no longer judged. His hands no longer searched bags carelessly. Each time he greeted someone, there was a sense of sincerity in his voice. "Good morning, sir. Have a safe trip." "Thank you, ma'am." "Enjoy your flight." At first, passengers looked surprised. Some smiled in return and others just nodded. But Miller didn't do it for attention. He did it because he finally understood what respect truly meant. During one quiet afternoon, as he stood near the conveyor belt, the same female officer who had been his supervisor during the incident walked up to him. She crossed her arms and smiled slightly. "You've changed," she said. Miller gave a small, humble nod. "I had to," he replied. "I don't want to be remembered as the man who judged someone by their looks." She looked at him thoughtfully. "Well, sometimes we all need a wake-up call. What matters is what we do after." Miller smiled faintly. "I think about that day every morning before I start my shift. It reminds me that power isn't in the uniform, it's in the way you treat people." His supervisor nodded approvingly. "That's a good lesson. Keep that mindset and you'll go far." As the days passed, more and more travelers noticed the change in his attitude. Some even left kind comments on the airport feedback forms, mentioning the friendly security officer at Gate 7. It wasn't fame or recognition he was after, but knowing that people left with a smile made him feel that maybe, just maybe, he was slowly making up for his mistake. Meanwhile, in another part of the world, Lito's work continued. After the conference in London, he traveled to several more countries, meeting with officials and organizations. His calm and humble nature earned him respect wherever he went. People admired how he carried himself, quiet but confident, firm but kind. But every now and then, during quiet moments in his hotel room, Lito thought back to that airport morning. Not with anger, but with reflection. He often wondered how the officer was doing, whether he had learned from the experience or simply moved on. One evening, While preparing his notes for a meeting, Lito received an email from his assistant. The subject line read, "Airport security staff message of appreciation." Curious, he opened it. Inside was a photo of a handwritten note that had been pinned to the staff notice board at the airport. It read, "Respect everyone who passes through these gates. You never know their story. Be kind first, always." There was no signature, but Lito somehow knew who had written it. He smiled softly, feeling a quiet warmth spread through him. It was enough. He didn't need an apology. Knowing that the lesson had been learned was more valuable than any formal words. A few weeks later, Lito returned home to the Philippines. The moment he stepped out of the airport back home, the warm air and familiar voices made him smile. His wife met him with a hug and his children ran up excitedly. "How was your trip?" his wife asked as they walked to the car. "It was good," Lito said with a smile. "Busy but meaningful." She looked at him, sensing something deeper behind his words. "Something happened, didn't it?" He chuckled softly. "Yes. I met someone who reminded me how important respect is, and even when you don't receive it back." That night, as they sat around the dinner table, his children listened as he shared the story of what had happened at the airport. He told it not to complain but to teach. His teenage son asked, "So you didn't get angry, Dad?" Lito smiled. "I wanted to, but anger only hurts yourself." Sometimes silence speaks louder. When you stay calm, people remember it more. His daughter nodded thoughtfully. "That's hard to do." "Yes," Lito said, "but it's worth it." The next morning, Lito received a message from the same airport's administration. They wanted to express their gratitude for the way he had handled the situation. The message read, "Your patience and humility have left a lasting impression on our staff. We are conducting empathy and respect training based on your example." He felt humbled reading it. One small act of patience had started something much bigger, a ripple effect. Back at the airport, Miller was invited to help lead one of those training sessions. The idea was simple, to remind officers that behind every traveler was a story. When Miller stood in front of the group, wearing the same uniform he once took pride in, his heart pounded nervously. He began speaking slowly. "I made a mistake once," he said honestly. "I judged a man by how he looked. I spoke to him without respect. And I was wrong." The room was silent. No one expected such honesty. He didn't shout at me. He didn't fight back, Miller continued. He just stayed calm. And later, I found out he was a respected ambassador, someone who represented his country. That moment changed me. Because I realized, if I can treat someone like that just because I didn't know who he was, what does that say about me? He paused, letting the silence speak. Then he smiled gently. "Since that day, I promised myself one thing, to treat every traveler as if they were someone important. Because they are." The audience clapped softly, moved by his sincerity. Some officers even came up to him afterward to thank him for sharing his story. Later that evening, Miller sat alone near the terminal window watching planes take off. He thought about how strange life was, how one small moment of arrogance could turn into the biggest lesson of your life. But he was grateful that the man he had insulted chose kindness over anger. As he sat there, a young traveler approached him. "Sir," the traveler said, "you're the officer from Gate 7, right? The one from the story?" Miller blinked, a little surprised. "Yes, that's me." The traveler smiled. "I just wanted to say thank you. My mom told me that story. She said it taught her to always be kind to strangers." Miller felt his throat tighten slightly. "Thank you," he said softly. "That means a lot." After the traveler walked away, Miller looked out the window again, watching another plane rise into the sky. He wondered where it was headed. Maybe, just maybe, one of those passengers would be someone like Lito, quiet, humble, and full of lessons that life could never teach through books. A few days later, an envelope arrived for him at the airport. Inside was a small postcard showing a picture of London. The handwriting was familiar. "Kindness travels farther than any plane can. Keep spreading it." Lito, Miller smiled, reading it several times. The postcard wasn't long, but it carried more meaning than any formal apology or official letter ever could. He placed it in his locker, right beside the earlier letter from the embassy. Now, every morning before his shift, he would open that locker, read the postcard, and remind himself, be kind first. Over time, new officers joined the airport staff, and the story became something of a quiet legend, told during training, whispered between co-workers, shared as a lesson in empathy. Some said it was just a rumor. Others knew it was true, but for Miller it wasn't a story. It was his life, a reminder that respect could heal, humility could teach, and forgiveness could change a person completely. And for Lito, thousands of miles away, life went on peacefully. But every time he traveled through another airport, he made sure to greet every officer and staff member with warmth and respect. He believed that kindness was like a mirror. It always reflected back sooner or later. Neither man knew that one small incident had touched millions of hearts around the world. What had started as an insult had turned into a lesson that would last far longer than either of them expected. Because sometimes, the biggest change begins with something simple. A single moment of patience in the face of disrespect, and the courage to choose kindness instead of pride. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal at the airport. Travelers came and went. The loudspeaker called out boarding numbers, and security officers carried on with their daily routines. Yet deep inside, something had changed, not just in Officer Miller, but in the entire team that worked alongside him. Every morning when Miller clocked in, he made sure to stop by the notice board where the handwritten message still hung. Respect everyone who passes through these gates. You never know their story. The paper had faded a little, but its meaning only grew stronger with time. His colleagues often caught him glancing at it and smiling. One of the younger officers once asked him, "Sir, what made you write that?" Miller paused for a moment, remembering that morning. The heated words, the embarrassment, the lessons learned. "Because," he finally said, "I learned that one careless word can hurt someone deeply, but one small act of kindness can change everything." The young officer nodded quietly, absorbing those words like a student listening to an old teacher. As weeks went by, the airport became known for something unusual: its polite and respectful staff. Travelers often posted about their positive experiences online, sharing stories of officers who smiled, helped with bags, or treated them kindly. It seemed like the spirit of respect had become part of the airport's identity, and though no one said it out loud, everyone knew where it had started, with that one traveler from the Philippines. Far away, in a quiet town back home, Lito was enjoying a peaceful evening with his family. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft orange and pink colors. His children were helping his wife prepare dinner, and the sound of laughter filled the small house. For the first time in a long while, Lito had taken a break from his busy work. He had traveled across many countries in the past months, attending meetings and helping communities. But home was where his heart truly rested. As they sat down for dinner, his wife noticed a small smile on his face. "You look peaceful," she said softly. Lito nodded. "I am. I've been thinking a lot lately, about that airport officer, about everything that happened." She looked at him curiously. "Do you still think about that?" "Sometimes," Lito admitted, "but not with anger. More with gratitude. You see, it reminded me that sometimes we're placed in situations not to prove others wrong, but to teach them something without even realizing it." His wife smiled warmly. "And maybe to remind yourself too, and all that patience can move mountains." Lito chuckled. "Yes, that too." A few days later, Lito was invited to speak at a large international event about cultural understanding and respect in global travel. He hesitated at first. Public attention wasn't something he sought. But his colleagues convinced him that his story could inspire people, especially in a world where misunderstandings often grew from small judgments. When the day came, Lito stood on a big stage facing hundreds of people, government officials, travelers, and airport staff from around the world. The lights were bright, but his voice was calm as he began to speak. He didn't mention the officer's name or the country. He simply shared the lesson: how a single act of disrespect can wound someone, but how choosing patience can turn that same moment into something powerful and good. He told them how the officer had later changed, how the airport introduced respect training, and how kindness had replaced pride. By the end of his speech, the audience stood and applauded. Some even had tears in their eyes. They weren't clapping for his position or title. They were clapping for the simple truth he spoke from his heart. After the event, a few people came to meet him backstage. One woman, an airport manager from another country, said, Your story reminded me that we all wear uniforms, but beneath them, we're all just people trying to do our best. Leto smiled gently. Exactly. And respect doesn't cost anything, but it gives everything. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Miller's life had taken a quiet but meaningful turn. He had become known as someone new officers could look up to, not because of his rank, but because of his compassion. Whenever a young recruit joined the team, he would take them aside and say, "Before you look at someone's passport, look at their face. They're not just a traveler. They're a person with a story."